I'm no Tom Cruise on so many levels. First of all, I'm taller than him, even without heels. So you might say, why Mission Impossible? Well, 3 reasons. First, I thought maybe after 3 weeks we were kind of missing Frank's modern day references to movies and pop culture and things like that. Second, I've had a few folks imply that I have an impossible mission to follow both Rhonda and Carrie in the pulpit. And third, well, it's a title, it's a theme, it's a song that's really cross-generational. So I thought most of us could relate to it because thanks to Peter Graves in the series from 1966 to 1973, remember that Mission Impossible? And now, of course, the movie series, the whole series with Mr. Tom Cruise, none other than Tom Cruise. So we just saw that sequel, and it caught my attention, and it made me think about the importance of any mission. But maybe the real reason that I chose this theme comes from my experience traveling in the Middle East this spring and being overwhelmed by the struggles and the persecution and the conflict between Israel and Palestine. As Paris and I would say after every conversation we had over there, whether it was with Palestinian Christians or a retired Israeli general or a Muslim sheikh, or even after having a Shabbat experience with an Orthodox Jewish rabbi and his family, every time we walked away, we would say, it's complicated. It's really complicated. So I think that's when this message started forming. That's when I kept asking the question, how can I or how can we make a difference? And it's also when I was reminded that we could and we should make a difference right where we are. We can change the world from right where we are, within our own circle of influence. So after Cheryl and I talked about this morning having a mission focus, my hope was that perhaps this familiar song and that familiar theme would imprint in your mind and your heart too as you think about mission. So let's start with a look at the scripture passage from this morning that Jean just shared. Jesus and his disciples went through Galilee, and they didn't want anyone to know because he was telling him about his impending death. And so they really didn't understand it, but they were afraid to ask him about it. Now I can just imagine Jesus' level of frustration with the disciples. I mean, after all, these were the friends, the guys that he hung out with, that he traveled with, that he taught. I mean, I can only imagine that Jesus probably just is like, oh, because that's what Paris does. He rubs his head, oh, I'm so frustrated. I can imagine him doing that and being really disappointed at the same time, not only because they didn't understand, but because they didn't even have the courage to ask him about it. How often are we afraid to ask the hard questions in the church? How much do we divert to side conversations to really avoid the tough conversations? Is it perhaps the hard conversations in the church that really help us to understand the mind and the heart of Christ? But maybe we just don't want to be uncomfortable. So our attention gets diverted, not just to the unimportant, but sometimes to the things of the world rather than the message of the gospel. So then we move on into the scripture, and they come to Capernaum. And when he was in the house, he said to them, actually asked them, what have you been arguing about? And they were silent. For on the way they had been talking about who would be the greatest. And he sat down and he called the 12 over and he said, whoever wants to be first must be last of all and servant of all. And then he took a little child and he put it among them, and taking it in his arms, he said to them, whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me. And whoever welcomes me welcomes not me, but the one who sent me. Now I have a new visual for this scripture after Paris and I traveled through Israel and Palestine, but also after hearing Dr. Jonathan Reed, the professor of religion at Laverne, who spoke at an Insight Luncheon at annual conference this year about the socioeconomic context in which Jesus lived and taught. Not too unlike today, Jesus lived and taught in an occupied Palestine. The disciples, in many ways, were similar to the Palestinians of today, persecuted by the occupying Romans, questioning and questioned by the religious leaders of the day, and living a bit of an itinerant lifestyle. Now, according to Dr. Reed, the average age for the Jewish male in that time and place was about 35. So perhaps Jesus talking about death at the age of 33 was not that unusual. And they saw persecution, the disciples saw persecution and death all around them, not that unlike today. So I can imagine that they wouldn't want to pay a lot of attention to Jesus as he talked with them about his impending death, especially since most of us don't like to talk about things we're afraid of. And I can visualize Jesus and his disciples coming into Capernaum, especially since we had lunch on a hillside near there where tradition has it that Jesus blessed the loaves and the fishes and fed the multitudes. And I can imagine them looking for a quiet place. It's a beautiful, desolate, quiet area. And settling down, because that would be important, because they didn't want to draw crowds, because if Jesus drew crowds, that put him more at risk. And as they settled in and they quieted down, Jesus turned to them. And he said, "So what were you arguing about on the way?" And then silence. Since they had been talking about which one of them was the greatest. And I can imagine Jesus calling the 12 of them together and giving a little lesson about getting their priorities straight, teaching them about servant leadership. Now, I studied a book years ago called The Upside Down Kingdom by Don Crable, good Mennonite author. And it's an interesting read because Don looks at many ways that Jesus turns the normal cultural thinking upside down. Servant leadership, upside down thinking. Well, along with this upside down thinking, this also may not be a scripture you immediately think of when you think about mission. I think most of us probably go to Matthew 28:19, "Go therefore and make ye disciples of all nations." We envision, or at least I've envisioned, missions and missionaries as people serving overseas. Hence my visual aid. I took a note from Rhonda's playbook and decided that I would wear one of my props. Well done. And the reason I decided to wear this was as a reminder for me about how I used to think of service and mission. You see, I used to see missionaries as the folks like Phil and Louis Raymond, or Roger and Carolyn Schrock, or Norm and Carol Waggy. I'd see those folks at annual conference, and they'd be in their mission attire. Matter of fact, Paris told me early on in our married life that he thought the only way I would ever be happy was in burlap and sandals, serving overseas, doing mission work, and really feeling like I made a difference. You can see how that worked out. But I hope with a few years of maturity and wisdom, I've now realized that our mission field is wherever we are, our circle of influence, because service translates into mission. And that's what I hear in this passage of Scripture. What are the words or images that resonate with you from this passage? For me, it's back to the image of them arriving and going into the house after Jesus has attempted to prepare them for his impending death, and then asking, "What were you guys arguing about? What were you bantering about?" And they realize they are clearly busted. Because if they've been paying attention at all, they know that Jesus has been teaching that it's not about being number one. It's not about being the most important. It's about serving others. It was an obvious model for servant leadership. So we don't necessarily need a theme song or elaborate clothing to make a difference where we are. We can make a difference just like we are. Now, that's not to mean to minimize the importance of international missionaries. I still love to see Norman and Carol were at district conference yesterday, and they had their bright, I'm guessing maybe Puerto Rican DR garb on, and it was great to see them in that. And I hope that today, someone or someones in this congregation